Okay, welcome to the starting lecture on probably one of the most controversial times in U.S. history, and that is the Vietnam War era and the counterculture movements that occur in the 1960s and 1970s. Vietnam, the war, why it's going on, why particularly American involvement is something that people, even at the time, didn't understand. And so, if you are listening to it and you find it complicated, absolutely don't feel alone because it's a really complicated topic with so many very passionate feelings on either side. So be sure as you're listening to this that you're writing down questions you have, that there if there are things that you don't understand, you need to make sure that you make a list of them and you write them down so that we can be sure to discuss them in class. All right, so this is my attempt to do the Vietnam War in the simplest possible way that I know how to do it, but that means it's going to be about a bajillion slides. So bear with me. Here we go. The U.S. involvement in Vietnam begins in 1950 during the French Indochina War. Indochina refers to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The three countries there together are referred to as Indochina. And they were colonized by the French. And it's during the 1950s, following World War II, when France begins to lose control, that the U.S. says, of course that would happen. Um, the U.S. begins sending. Okay, sorry, there was a pause. Uh, anyway, so U.S. provides France with lots of economic assistance because remember, our ultimate goal past World War II is fighting communism, and we didn't want Vietnam to be easy targets for communists. All right, so this is looking at what we know to be Indochina. So here is Vietnam. Here's Laos and here's Cambodia. There's China up there, just to give you perspective of a world map. I probably will come back to this a lot. All right, so we're going to go back and trace the French rule in Vietnam because that kind of matters. So in the late 1800s through World War II, France rules Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Why were the French interested in it? Well, the French during the period of imperialism, so just like remember America wanted the Philippines, and because we wanted to be close to China, France is also practicing imperialism, just like the other major world powers were at the time, and they colonized Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. They were interested in rice and rubber plantations that were there. So rubber is comes from the sap of special trees, and that was important because think about it, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we are moving toward a more mobile society. So cars are needing them for tires. We're needing rubber for other inventions, particularly during World War I. Rubber is needed for the tread on tanks, etc. Rice can only be grown in certain places because in order for rice to grow, the fields have to flood, and the rice paddies themselves grow in the flooded fields. For example, that's why the lowland area of Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia were big rice growing areas during the early colonial periods. So, just like what happens with pretty much any country when they imperialize another country, and France not only economically, politically imperialized Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, they also militarily imperialized them. And the French that came over to set up the rice and rubber plantations used the locals as virtual slave labor. That wasn't very popular, and many fled over to China over the years. During that time, there's a large Indo-Chinese community living in the country of China. And in 1924, as we began to see around the world the rise of communist and socialist parties following World War I, there is a group known as the Indo-Chinese Communist Party that forms in China, made up of people that consider themselves from Indochina. So they had fled Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia. They live in a community in the country of China, and they formed their own group called the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. It's just a political party. It's led by a guy named Ho Chi Minh, who cannot help what his name is, and he will become very important later on. So in 1940, as Japan begins expanding in the Pacific, um, going to and during World War II, Japan takes control of Vietnam. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh, who had been in China and was the leader of the Indo-Chinese Communist Political Party, forged a group called the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh's goal was Vietnamese independence. They wanted Vietnam free from Japanese rule, and they wanted them to be an independent country. Well, the United States gives funding in the forms of money, weapons, training, etc., to the Viet Minh Party because we had a common enemy. We had Japan. And so if the Viet Minh were going to fight Japan during World War II, we were all about that. We were happy to help them. In the end, of course, the United States is victorious, Japan is defeated, and the Hanoi is declared the capital of Vietnam. And if you just want to see, here's Hanoi way up here. So here's where the problem comes in. After World War II, the Vietnamese people had really thought that they were going to get independence. That was sort of their goal or their reasoning for fighting the Japanese. They thought the Americans were all behind it because we were assisting them, but we weren't. And when the World War II is over, France basically comes back into Vietnam and is like, awesome, thanks for beating the Japanese. Let's go back to the way things were. But the Vietnamese people are like, yeah, we're not okay with that. That's not cool at all. It is very comparable to the Filipino people who helped the Americans defeat the Spanish during the Spanish-American War and then assumed that they were going to get independence. And when that wasn't happening, if you remember, Emilio Equinaldo led the Filipino people in a revolt against the Americans, which we violently put down because, you know, we didn't want to set them free, and it was a big debate within the United States and in our class. So France comes back, and they are having a lot of trouble quelling and keeping down the Vietnamese. Why? Because the Vietnamese have now been trained to fight. They've been given weapons and they've been given money by the U.S. because we wanted them to fight Japan. I don't know that we really thought through what would happen, and nor did we. I don't think we really cared. And so France comes to the United States because we're allies, we're part of NATO, we're all together, and France is asking for the United States to assist them. And the U.S. is like, yeah, we're not ready to get involved in another war. We don't want to send our military. Then we get dragged into the Korean War. And so we just send money to France. And we're like, France, you need to step up your game. If you got problems with the Vietnamese people, you need to deal with it. But here's some money to help you out. So Eisenhower in 54, when he's president, remember, he comes in, tough stance on communism. Communism isn't spreading. We had already lost China. We had already kind of not done great with the Korean War. And this concept named the domino theory is introduced. And you need to remember this. The domino theory says that if one country in Asia falls to communism, all the rest will, like a series of dominoes. And it is believed that that is coming to fruition. China fell, North Korea fell, and we see that coming with the other Asian countries becoming to jump on board with communism. Why? They see it working in China and the Soviet Union, and they're like, well, we're poor. Why don't we do that? Why don't we all get together, share everything? It's going to be awesome because it seems to be working for these other countries. And for the United States, this is a heavy population of the world. And for the United States, this is the worst possible thing because if those countries all fall to communism, we're pretty sure the rest of the world's going to follow suit. And then it's going to have to be the United States versus the world, and we don't really want that. So May of 1954, France surrenders to the Viet Minh at a location called Dien Bien Phu. So France says, look, we can't fight it anymore. We quit. We're done. And Vietnam is split at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam is going to be communist. South Vietnam is just going to be not communist. They're not a democracy. They're not a socialist. They're just not communist. The capital of the North is Hanoi, and the capital of the South is Saigon. The plan was, this happens in 54, the plan is that there will be an election in 1956 that will reunify the country. They will have one election, they will elect one leader, and Vietnam will be one big happy country again. That's the plan. It does not go according to plan. The leader of South Vietnam is named Ngo Dinh Diem. You may call him NDD. I think saying his name is fun. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but that's how I've always heard it pronounced, and it's a joy to say. So Ngo Dinh Diem is a mean man. He runs a dictatorship regime, but he's not communist, and so the Americans support him and fund him. Um, and so he's in charge from 1955, and 1956 comes along, and Ngo Dinh Diem is like, yeah, I'm not participating in any elections. South Vietnam, we aren't having elections. I'm your ruler. I'm the leader. That's how it goes. Too bad, so sad, not happening. And the United States is like, yeah, we're kind of cool with that. Why? Because we knew if there was a general election in which all the Vietnamese people, North and South, were allowed to vote for one leader, they're going to pick the leader of North Vietnam, Communist Ho Chi Minh, and we couldn't have that. Remember, we are committed to containment. We are committed to not having any takeover of we are committed to not having any takeover of communism anywhere. We can't have that occur, so we're willing to let Ngo Dinh Diem stay in power with extremely corrupt government because he's not communist. And we recognize he's probably not the best leader, and that's what we've got. So some examples of Ngo Dinh Diem, what he does isn't cool. So he is Catholic, which is completely fine. That's his religious choice. But the majority of his country is Buddhist, and he doesn't like that. And so he tortures and persecutes the Buddhists living within his country. And one of the most popular images, which I have taken out, I don't know why, is the Buddhist monks began launching protests against Ngo Dinh Diem, trying to get recognition. And there are cases of the monks literally pouring gasoline and setting themselves on fire. You can look up the picture. In an effort, yes, of course they died, because if you set yourself on fire like the way they did, you're going to die. But to draw attention to the atrocities of Ngo Dinh Diem. So here's where things get complicated if you aren't already confused. Within South Vietnam, so communist, not communist. Within South Vietnam, there is a group that forms called the Viet Cong. Their nickname is the VC. In U.S. military speak, when you give initials, every letter of the alphabet has a word attached to it. So you're not like, did you say P or D? So it's Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, Gamma. I don't know all the rest. But in U.S. military speak, VC is known as Victor Charlie. And oftentimes it was just shortened as Charlie. So a lot of times when you hear people talking about during the Vietnam War, we were fighting Charlie, that's not a person. It's referring to the Viet Cong, Viet Cong group is what we'll call them. So the Viet Cong is a communist rebel group that forms in South Vietnam. So Viet Cong is a group that want to rebel against Ngo Dinh Diem. They form in South Vietnam, and they are communist. They are heavily funded and supported by North Vietnam, who under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh would like to take over South Vietnam, make it one communist country. That is the goal. The Viet Cong eventually changed their name to the National Liberation Front, but they're never referred to as that. So we're going to refer to them as the Viet Cong. So Ho Chi Minh is like, Viet Cong, I love what you're doing. You're making my job easier. And he creates this pathway that goes through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam, known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And on that trail, he sends weapons and money and at times soldiers into South Vietnam to be delivered to the Viet Cong. He starts this in 1959. South Vietnam by 1959 is in a hot mess of problems. There's serious, serious, serious trouble. The United States, because of the containment policy, Truman Doctrine, and the domino theory, decide to send military advisors into Vietnam. That is done in 1961 under the leadership of John F. Kennedy. The military advisors are only supposed to be there to stabilize the South Vietnamese government, but they're there with guns, and there are military operations going on in 61, but it's very quiet. We don't want anyone to know. Things just get worse. Ngo Dinh Diem becomes more unstable. He launches more attacks on his own people. And by 1963, the U.S. government is like, this guy is crazy. We've got to get rid of him. So our CIA goes into South Vietnam, and we have Ngo Dinh Diem assassinated. And he is off the power. Bad Ngo Dinh Diem. He's gone in 63. Our CIA has him killed. We replace him with someone we like better. Still a crazy person, but someone we like better. So, things are really not going well in Vietnam. And in August 2nd, 1964, at this point, the U.S. president is Lyndon Johnson. He is finishing the term of John F. Kennedy. He will be up for election on his own in November of 64. And Vietnam is in a big election issue. So in August of 64, there is an American boat, that's my boat, called the USS Maddox. It is stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. Now, that's not unusual. In areas that are highly of interest to the Americans, we have warships stationed out there just in case. For example, we have warships stationed outside Syria just because, they got problems, so we need to be there in case. Well, what the story is that in August of 1964, the North Vietnamese it is reported that they attempt to fire on the USS Maddox. Nothing happens, they miss. 2 days later, which would be August 4th, 1964, there are a lot of conflicting reports about what happens, but the official report that is on August 4th, 1964, once again, the North Vietnamese send torpedoes to the USS Maddox, and that they hit, or that they're continuing to attempt to attack us. They're attempting to blow up an American ship. This should sound familiar because this is exactly what was used by the American government to start the Spanish-American War. Remember the Maine? Remember a war that the U.S. businessmen wanted and the U.S. wanted for imperialism, but we didn't really have any justification? Remember the Mexican-American War that we fought to get California, but we had to trick Mexico into war because there wasn't justification for a war. Remember, every war has to have a boogeyman. And if we don't have one, there have been times where we've had to kind of go around to make one. I am absolutely not saying the North Vietnamese did not fire upon the USS Maddox. Please do not write me angry emails. I am saying that it is very conflicting reports about what happened that day. I am saying that it follows a trend of U.S. policy when we are attempting to go into war for what we believe is our own advantage or is self-serving to United States policy. You got to stay on top. You got to do what it takes. So, because of the issue of the USS Maddox, the U.S. government, under Lyndon Johnson, who wins the election in November of 64, but this happens in August, passes the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Oh my goodness, remember this. And the Tonkin Gulf Resolution passed by the U.S. Congress on August 7th allows all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against U.S. forces and to prevent further aggression. It is a blank check. It allows Lyndon Johnson to do whatever he feels is necessary to keep Americans safe from the attack of dirty North Vietnam, to prevent the domino theory from becoming real. What that means is that he doesn't need a congressional declaration of war. We never declare war on Vietnam because we don't need to. He can divert as much money as he wants, as much military resources as he wants. He can start a draft, all because of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution as essentially a blank check that says, Johnson, you do, or U.S. President, you do what you need to do that you think is militarily a good move in Vietnam, and Congress has authorized you to do so. That is not legal in the United States today because of what happened in Vietnam. We make serious changes. The election of 64 happens. Johnson wins. My goodness me. February 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder begins. It is the first sustained bombing of North Vietnam. So our first military advisors, quote unquote, go on in 61. We get the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in 64. And 65, at the beginning of 65, right after the inauguration of Lyndon Johnson, we begin bombing North Vietnam. Again, our reasoning is containment, spreading communism, stopping the spread of communism. Truman Doctrine pretty much holds us to it, and the fear of the domino theory. That is our reason for being involved in Vietnam. Vietnam at its core is a civil war. It is a fight between North and South Vietnam over who's going to gain control. The United States interest in that is that we don't want communism to spread. I told you we were really committed to it. By June of 65, 50,000 U.S. soldiers are now in Vietnam fighting the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong is the group that forms in South Vietnam, that is a rebel group that is attempting to overthrow the South Vietnamese government. They are funded by North Vietnam, who gets them things through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. All right. So even after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is passed, Johnson's like, I don't want to send like a ton of soldiers on the ground. Not sure that's the direction we want to go. But by March, he's like, let's just send everybody go to Vietnam. He's heavily advised by Robert McNamara, who's the Secretary of Defense, and Dean Rusk, who's the Secretary of State. Americans at the beginning of the Vietnam War, and you really want to note this, are super duper into this. So in his 1964 campaign, there's an issue about him in communism, but long story short, people see him as very tough on communism. And 61%, the overwhelming majority of Americans, support the Vietnam War. They're like, we need to stop communism. Those commies are coming for us. We got to stop them. They're going to get us. They're going to take American everything. We can't have that. There are always those that disagree. Oh, I'm so sorry. By the end of 65, we have 180,000 troops in Vietnam. Wow, that's a lot. How are we getting all those troops? We're drafting people. So there are a few exclusions from the draft. One is college education, but remember, student loans aren't really an option, so that means you kind of have to be wealthy. You can have a religious exemption, but that may not exempt you from getting drafted. So the reality for a lot of teens is if you were a male and you graduated high school, you were going to Vietnam. American young people are very politically involved because they see what's happening to their fathers, their brothers, their cousins, their boyfriends, their husbands, their friends. And that's why the activism against the Vietnam War is so big against young people, because they see what's happening. It's also against older people, but young people are there. So the U.S. commander in South Vietnam is General William Westmoreland. And our goal is to train the South Vietnamese army to fight the Viet Cong for themselves. That should sound familiar. That is our plan in Iraq and Afghanistan. We will see how it works in South Vietnam, and then you can judge how well that might work in the future. Not saying it's not working. I'm just saying let's follow patterns. And so Westmoreland's like, so here's what we're just basically going to need to do. We're just going to need to send more and more troops, because that Viet Cong army has a lot of people. And North Vietnamese, they're kind of sending some troops down here. So we need a lot of people. Just please sending troops, lots and lots of troops. And so by 67, 2 years after the first sustained bombing, there are 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. Again, got to prevent domino theory, have to prevent containment. So, fighting the war. It becomes really difficult. Essentially, we weren't really ready for what it was that happened and what was going on there. And I feel like I'm going to cover those particular, I'm going to look at our time here. Yeah, I'm going to cover those in class because I've gone on now for 25 minutes and I'm hoping you're not thoroughly confused. Again, if you had questions, absolutely write them down because I need to make sure that you're not confused. So please make sure that you're writing down questions, things that you don't understand. We will cover slides 10 through 14 or 9 through 14 in class because it's just easier for me to do it that way. And then we're going to watch something that will help you better understand it. So that's the end of this one. Again, please write down questions. I hope you're not confused.